Hi everyone, it's Neil Bennett here from the Worship Foundation, and welcome to our first video in this series that I hope will ask some questions and help us all think a little bit more deeply about worship. And I've called this first one what we talk about when we talk about worship, because it seems to me that we all talk about worship differently, which makes conversation and discussion challenging. I often think that if you get 20 worship leaders in a room, you'll have 40 different views about worship, all deeply held and passionately believed in, based on lived experiences. And if you look at theologians and authors as well, you'll find a vast array of definitions of worship that they have landed on, and I'm one of them. And a theological reflection on all of them will produce great fruit. But they're all different. Within contemporary church culture, of course, we tend to talk about worship in terms of singing. Although, of course, no one believes that worship is just about singing, right? But we use that language. If someone comes up to you at the end of the morning service and says, "How was the worship?" what they invariably mean is, "How was the singing?" So we have worship CDs and worship conferences and worship ministries all focused on the singing. And we have worship leaders in church who lead the singing. If we look to our worship songwriters, we find another range of ideas. You'll know some of these songs. Brian Dirksen says, "Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart." So worship is something I'm going to do now, and it involves my heart. For Matt Redman, I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about Jesus. So the heart of worship is Jesus. It's hard not to agree with that. Or for Tim Hughes, here I am to worship, here I am to bow down. There's something I'm going to do now, and it's called worship, and it involves a physical posture of prostration. So worship leaders, authors, theologians, our churches, our songwriters, all of them talk about worship differently. And so many of the ideas, they're good, but it makes having proper conversations about worship quite hard. So why are there so many differences of worship? And I've been thinking about that for a while now. Why so many definitions, good definitions of worship? And I think one of the reasons is that the word worship is a very flexible word in the English language. The word worship literally means give worth. So if we worship something, we give them worth. If we worship God, we give them worth. So anything that gives worth to God is worship of God. There's what I call the colloquial definition, the person in the street definition. You ask the person on the street what worship is, and they'll invariably say, well, that's the religious stuff you do in church, the songs, the readings, the prayers, the sermon. So the colloquial definition is something like religious acts of devotion towards a deity. Then the word worship is also a title. It's a sign of respect. You'd say to a judge, "Your worship." It's also a word that describes our obsessions. We might say of someone, they worship the ground that person walks on. They're obsessed with a person. They worship a person. It's also part of a promise in a wedding service. It's a promise of single-minded devotion. And there are probably more. The word worship in the English language is a very flexible word. I think another reason we've got so many different ways of talking about worship around at the moment is that, particularly in the contemporary worship movement, we've developed our theology informally. It's probably true to say that up to now our movement has been largely creatively led, but I'm not sure how good we've been at theologically reflecting on all the experiences that we've had. I think also I've found quite often that theology can be viewed rather skeptically. Bring in a theologian and you'll probably crush the very life of the Spirit that you enjoy. And I think part of what I would hope as a movement we would grow in understanding of is that good theology fuels the life of the Spirit, and the life of the Spirit fuels good theology. And one of the other reasons I think we have so many different ways of talking about worship is the different English translations of the Bible that we use. If we do a word search on the word worship, we'll find that different translations translate different sets of words into our English word worship, with considerable crossover, of course, but there's some key differences. To illustrate this, an example would be Romans 12, 1-2, verses that are so often used in discussions on worship. And the ESV puts it like this. It talks about presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. But the ASV doesn't say spiritual worship, it says spiritual service. And the King James Version doesn't say either, it says reasonable service. I'm always encouraged when worship leaders read their Bibles when they're talking and thinking about worship, but even on the basis of that one example, we can see how, depending on which translation of the Bible you use, the way you talk about worship may be very different to someone else who uses a different translation. So there we are. Why are there so many different ways of talking about worship around at the moment? Well, for three main reasons: the flexibility of the word worship in the English language, the way we've developed our theology informally in the contemporary worship movement particularly, and the different English translations of the Bible that we use. And I guess where I want to finish this is asking you this question: what do you talk about when you talk about worship, and why?